People often reflect on all their mistakes and regrets when they're about to shuffle loose this mortal coil. Some people wish they spent more time with their families and less time at work, and maybe traveled more. But others confess to crimes that often go hand in hand with a final meal and free electricity for life. And they would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that meddling conscience. So, today we're admitting to the most shocking deathbed confessions from history. But before we spill the beans, why don't you all head on over to that subscribe button? Then, confess to us in the comments what other solved mysteries you want to know about. For now, please listen closely. We don't have much time. In 1974, 17-year-old Amy Billig had engrossed herself fully into the motorcycle outlaw subculture. It was rough, rowdy, dangerous, and cool. So when she disappeared on March 4th, 1974, her family figured that obsession had something to do with it. After arriving home from school, Billing got dressed and then headed back out into a van to visit her dad at his place of business. Amy never made it. The search for the young woman was wide, with the whole devastated community of Coconut Grove, Florida, getting in on the survey. Aside from Amy's camera found on the side of a highway, no other leads nor whereabouts were ever discovered. Eventually, a lead revealed that Amy had been taken by members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club in the Everglades. Paul Branch, a former enforcer for the Pagans, admitted that he had picked Billing up, driven her to a party where she allegedly overdosed, and disposed of her body in the Everglades to be handled by the many alligators who lived there. Branch allegedly admitted all of this to his wife on his deathbed in 1998. The Pagans have since denied all involvement or wrongdoing, and Billig's family remained unconvinced by Branch's version of events. William Desmond Taylor was a popular silent film director and actor in the early 1900s. Think Clint Eastwood, if he had been born just slightly earlier. So when Taylor was slain on February 1st, 1922, many Hollywood insiders as well as fans were shocked and saddened, kicking off one of the most high-profile investigations of the early 20th century. With no witnesses present, investigators had little to go on. A search of the home ruled out robbery, as many expensive items were left behind, leading most to believe this was a crime of passion. But nobody suspected Margaret Gibson, a former actress who was once Taylor's colleague. In fact, since the investigation mostly focused on collaborators and jilted lovers, Gibson's name wasn't even listed on the suspect list. Nonetheless, in her final moments, Gibson requested a priest and confessed to calling Taylor's final curtain. At that time, Gibson was going by an alias, Pat Lewis, and had her own turbulent history in Hollywood. So her deathbed confession, which included no motive and nothing linking her to the incident, was left with skepticism. Despite the admission, the case is still considered unsolved to this day. Sightings of the Loch Ness Monster had been reported in Loch Ness beginning in the 6th century, but it wasn't until the 1930s that some real, concrete evidence surfaced. Loch Ness Monster fever had really been taking off around 1933, causing a surge in tourism and a renewed interest in the mystery of the lake. Colonel Robert Wilson jumped in on the spectacle in 1934 during a drive near the loch. Wilson claimed he not only saw something swimming, but he was able to stop for a closer look and even get a picture to boot. Not wanting credit for the photo, Wilson's image was credited as the surgeon's photo, and for decades was believed to be the only photographic proof of the monster's existence. You've absolutely seen this photo at least once. But the thing about the unexplained is that someone is always going to make an attempt to explain them. Like in 1984, when author Stuart Campbell scrutinized the image, determining whatever was in the water could not have been more than 2 or 3 feet long, and likely had a simple explanation. While Campbell and other skeptics were right about the fake, they were wrong about the methods. When he was in his 90s and near death, a man named Christian Sperling admitted that he had been in on the hoax of the surgeon's photo along with Wilson and his own Loch Ness-obsessed stepfather, Marmaduke Wetherell. In reality, the massive prehistoric Nessie depicted in the photo was no more than a 12-inch high wooden neck on top of a toy submarine submerged in a bathtub. The photo was handed off to Wilson, who was able to use his credibility to present the photo as fact. In 1995, a woman was found beaten, burned, and deceased in an abandoned house in Nashville, Tennessee. There were credible suspects, but no evidence to back up the claims, so the cold case remained unsolved for nearly 15 years. Fast forward to 2009, we meet Nashville prison inmate James Washington, who was behind bars for a second-degree murder conviction from 2006. Washington was said to suffer either a heart attack or seizure while in prison, and the possibility of his impending doom caused him to admit to a prison guard that he was the one who killed Joyce Goodiner all those years ago. However, fate had different plans for Washington, who made a full recovery and immediately tried to take back his confession, claiming it was all a hallucination. But when Washington was put on trial for the crime, it was revealed that he'd had a relationship with the victim, which is difficult to hallucinate. One 3-day trial later, and Washington was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Before he was the host of America's Most Wanted, John Walsh became an advocate for justice after the high-profile slaying of his 6-year-old son. The show allowed Walsh to help other grieving families find closure and was a hit on the Fox network for 24 seasons and beyond. Walsh's attachment to the show came after his own 6-year-old son vanished from a Sears department store on July 27, 1981, while only being out of his mother's sight for only a few minutes. Adam's partial remains were found in a canal 100 miles away from the Hollywood, Florida mall where he was last seen alive. The boy's father never gave up trying to find who was responsible for the heinous act, and through the TV show, became an advocate for missing children everywhere. There were several suspects, including one Otis Toole. Toole ended up in prison for another slaying, where he confessed that he, along with notorious serial murderer Henry Lee Lucas, had abducted Adam, only later to recant the confession. But in his final moments, Toole confirmed to his niece that he'd done the crime. Officially, the case is closed, with Toole as the culprit. When Joan Harrison's body was discovered in a garage in 1975, she was considered another unfortunate victim of the Yorkshire Ripper, who was terrorizing England at the time. Later identified as Peter Sutcliffe, the Ripper was responsible for slaying 13 women between 1976 and 1981. However, he was not responsible for Joan Harrison's fate. Several decades later, convicted sex offender Christopher Smith was arrested for driving under the influence. His DNA was collected and later found to match the DNA from Harrison's body. After Smith's passing, authorities discovered a letter he had written, in which he seemingly confessed to the crime, albeit indirectly. Smith in the letter had said that he wanted to set the record straight and could no longer live with the guilt he had for 20 years. The note also included an apology to anyone he hurt. While compelling, the note was not confirmed as a confession until DNA evidence was officially linked to Smith. James Brewer and his wife Dorothy were living in Tennessee in 1977, getting ready for Star Wars, welcoming their new president Jimmy Carter, and shooting their neighbors in a jealous rage. Dorothy had been seen chatting up her neighbor and ex-boyfriend, James Carroll, and her husband James was none too happy about it. Convinced Carroll was trying to seduce his wife, Brewer blasted Carroll one night while Dorothy waited in the car, and the two fled the scene to Oklahoma, giving themselves new identities in the process. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Anderson, as they were now known, got really into Jesus during their time in hiding. And apparently, the killer formerly known as James had the guilt of his actions built up over the years. He eventually suffered a stroke in 2009 and, believing this was the end, called the police from his hospital bed and confessed to the whole thing to cleanse his soul before he passed. You can imagine his surprise when he went on to survive the stroke and continue living, though sans his deepest, darkest secret. He and Dorothy surrendered to Tennessee, where James was declared unfit to stand trial due to his illness. Dorothy was eventually found not guilty. Maria Rodolphe and her neighbor Kathy Sigmund went outside to play in the snow on the evening of December 3, 1957, when they were approached by a young man in his early 20s. Kathy ran into her house to grab a doll, and when she returned, both Maria and the older guy were nowhere to be found. What followed was to become the oldest cold case in the nation's history. The city of Sycamore, Illinois, searched high and low for the girl or the assailant with no luck. For several months, there was no information, until Maria's skeletal remains were found in nearby Galena. Nobody was charged with the crime for the next several decades. Then, in 2008, Janet Tessier dropped a huge bomb on the Illinois State Police. Not only was her brother John responsible for the crime, but her own mother helped cover it up. When police asked Eileen Tessier where her son was that night, she lied and claimed he was miles away on a military base. Only after a deathbed confession in 1994 did she come clean about lying to cover for him. By then, John had been working as a police officer in Seattle and had changed his name to Jack McCullough. He was arrested and sentenced to life in prison in 2012. However, it was discovered that a collect call made at the time of the murder placed him in a completely different town. In 2017, a judge ruled that Tessier was innocent. What did we learn here today? Geraldine Kelly was the picture of a grieving widow. Her dear husband John had perished in a horrible traffic accident while on his way home to Massachusetts from California, and the family was just gutted. Except none of that was true. John was indeed dead. However, in 2004, Geraldine admitted she fudged a few of the details. Mainly, the traffic accident was actually a shotgun blast she had administered some 14 years earlier. See, after she did the deed, she stuffed her husband's body in a freezer, and, make sure you're sitting down for this, the body was still there. Kelly was losing her fight with cancer at age 54, and apparently wanted to face the end with a clear conscience. Sometime during the 1990s, Geraldine had shipped her husband's remains to Massachusetts, where it remained, until authorities searched the house on her tip. There, they found John's remains in an unplugged freezer sealed with duct tape. A motive for the incident remains unclear, but it does solve the mystery of the broken freezer Mom never threw out. So, what do you think? Which confession was the most shocking? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.